There are places on this earth that maps chose to forget. Places where the law stopped at the tree line and something older, darker, and far more dangerous took its place. Tonight, we go into those places. Deep into the hollows, swamps, and mountain passes of early America, where outlaws didn't just hide. They built worlds of their own. To understand these outlaw colonies, you first have to understand just how vast and ungoverned early America truly was. We romanticize the founding of this nation, the Constitution, the courts, the sheriffs with their badges. But the truth is far messier. O2 in the 1700s and well into the 1800s. The United States federal government had authority over a surprisingly thin slice of its own territory. Beyond the towns, beyond the post roads, beyond the last church steeple you could see on the horizon, there was simply nothing, nor courts, no judges, no marshals, nothing but wilderness so thick and deep that entire communities could vanish inside it and never be found. Historians call these zones ungoverned spaces, but the people who lived in them called them something simpler: home. The Appalachian Mountain Range, stretching over 1,500 miles, contained thousands of hollows, ridges, and remote valleys no surveyor or tax collector dared enter. The Great Dismal Swamp, straddling Virginia and North Carolina, spread across nearly 1 million acres of black water, cypress trees, and dense fog. The Ozark Plateau was a labyrinth of caves and forested ridgelines where a man could ride for 3 days without crossing a single road. These were not empty places. They were chosen places. Chosen by people who had decided that civilization, with all its rules, was something they wanted no part of. And so they built their own civilizations. Secret ones. Dangerous ones. Ones that lasted, in some cases, for generations. Let's begin with perhaps the most extraordinary outlaw colony in all of American history. A place so forbidding that even the most hardened slave hunters refused to enter it on foot. The Great Dismal Swamp. George Washington himself tried to drain it. He failed. And in that failure, he accidentally preserved one of the most remarkable human stories, beginning as early as the 1600s. The Dismal Swamp became a sanctuary for those who had the most desperate reason of all, to disappear. Enslaved people fleeing bondage, they were called Maroons, a term derived from the Spanish cimarron, meaning wild or untamed, and they didn't just hide in the swamp, they thrived. Deep inside the swamp, on elevated patches of dry land called islands, Maroon communities constructed entire settlements. They built wooden structures, cleared small plots for growing food, and established their own governance, trade routes, and social codes. Some historians estimate that at the height of this phenomenon, thousands of people were living inside the Dismal Swamp in organized communities. The swamp itself was their fortress. The water was dark, almost black, due to tannins leaching from the cypress roots. It concealed movement. It muffled sound. The ground shifted beneath your feet without warning. Poisonous snakes coiled in the shadows. The mosquitoes were legendary in their ferocity. And yet the people who knew the swamp, who had mapped it in their minds over years of careful exploration, moved through it with complete confidence. They traded with sympathetic people on the edges of the swamp. They occasionally raided plantations for tools, seeds, and supplies needed for survival. They defended their communities with a ferocity that came from knowing exactly what recapture meant. What makes the Dismal Swamp colony so haunting is not just its existence, it's its duration. These communities persisted for nearly 2 centuries. Long after the Civil War ended slavery, there were people still living deep in the Dismal Swamp who had been born there, whose parents had been born there. They had never in their lives set foot in the world outside. The swamp had become the only world they knew. Author Harriet Beecher Stowe, just before writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, wrote a lesser-known novel called Dread, directly inspired by the Dismal Swamp communities. She described it as a place where the voice of man was never heard, and yet it pulsed with a fierce, hidden human life. We move from the swamps to the mountains, from the darkness of Blackwater to the darkness of deep forests. And here, the outlaw colonies take on a very different character. By the early 1800s, the Appalachian Highlands had become home to a culture that operated almost entirely outside the reach of the federal government. These were not runaways in the traditional sense. Many were descendants of Scots-Irish immigrants who had come to America specifically because they despised centralized authority. They had fled religious persecution in Scotland, economic oppression in Ireland, and brutal landlordism across the British Isles. When they arrived in America, they kept moving west and upward until the mountains swallowed them completely. And there, they built something extraordinary. These highland communities developed their own legal systems, informal but rigidly enforced. Disputes were settled not in courts but in community meetings, or sometimes in violent but highly ritualized confrontations that everyone accepted as binding. Blood feuds became institutionalized, not as lawlessness, but as a substitute for law in places where official law had never arrived. The most famous product of these mountain cultures was, of course, whiskey. Not because these people were drunks, but because whiskey was currency. In the pre-banking era of isolated mountain life, a barrel of corn whiskey was portable wealth. It didn't spoil. It could be traded for tools, cloth, medicine, or livestock. When the federal government began taxing distilled spirits in 1791, the mountain communities simply refused to comply and retreated deeper into their hollows. The moonshine still became a symbol of defiance. Hidden in creek beds, tucked behind waterfalls, buried under false floors in barns, these operations were engineering marvels of concealment. The steam from the still would be run through copper coils submerged in cold creek water to prevent visible vapor. Operations ran at night, with lookouts posted on ridgeline's federal revenue agents, called revenuers by the locals, who ventured into these hollows sometimes simply vanished. Not always through violence. Sometimes they just got lost. The mountain communities knew every path, every false trail, every bog that looked like solid ground. Turin itself was weaponized. What's remarkable is that these weren't communities of criminals in any moral sense. They had schools, churches, and deeply held codes of honor and hospitality. A stranger who arrived in peace and respected the community's ways would be fed, sheltered, and protected. A stranger who arrived with a badge and a warrant was taking his life in his own hands. These mountain outlaw colonies persisted well into the 20th century. As late as the 1950s, there were families in remote Appalachian hollows that had not paid a federal tax. The Dismal Swamp and the Appalachian Hollows are the most famous examples, but they are far from the only ones. In the bayous of southern Louisiana, communities of mixed-race outcasts carved out their own isolated world in the cypress swamps along the Mississippi Delta. Known as redbones in some historical accounts, these groups developed a culture so distinct and so isolated that their descendants today still speak a dialect of French Creole. In the Ozark Mountains of Missouri and Arkansas, the pattern repeated itself. Communities descended from Civil War deserters retreated into the wilderness and stayed. Their descendants told conflicting family stories. Some believed their great-great-grandfathers were Union heroes. Others were certain they were Confederate veterans. The truth, buried under generations of deliberate silence, was that they were men who had simply walked away. Out west, in the canyonlands of Utah and Colorado, outlaw communities formed around a different kind of fugitive, the professional criminal. Robbers Roost, the hole-in-a-wall Browns Park. These were geographic features so remote and so defensible that they functioned as outlaw towns. Butch Cassidy and his associates didn't just use these places as hideouts between jobs. They lived there for months at a time, raising horses, hosting dances, too. Each of these communities shares a common thread. They existed because the land itself made them possible. And they persisted because the people who built them chose self-sufficiency. Here is the question that haunts historians, anthropologists, and anyone who has ever driven down a dirt road in rural Appalachia and noticed a house set so far back it barely seemed real. Do these communities still exist? The honest answer is, almost certainly, in some form, yes. The physical isolation is gone. Satellite imagery has mapped every square mile of American territory. And cell towers now reach places that once seemed permanently beyond civilization's reach. But cultural isolation, the deep, chosen separation from mainstream American society, persists in pockets all across the country. There are communities in the Appalachian Highlands where outside law enforcement officers are still met. With a silence so absolute it communicates its own message. There are bayou settlements in Louisiana where the same families have lived on the same land for 200 years and where the rest of America might as well exist on another planet. There are people living in the canyonlands of the American West whose grandparents were the last generation to deal in cash. Exclusively in cash with strangers from outside the community. The outlaw colonies of early America did not simply vanish. They evolved. They absorbed enough of the modern world to survive in it while keeping its most intrusive elements at arm's length. The moonshiner became the marijuana grower. The blood feud became the court case that drags on for 30 years and is ultimately settled out of court with a handshake. The lookout on the ridgeline became the neighbor who calls ahead with a quiet word of warning. The spirit that fierce, stubborn, often beautiful, and sometimes brutal insistence on living outside the terms that mainstream society tries to impose, that spirit did not die with the frontier. Chasse got quieter, more careful, more patient. For a day, America has always told itself a story about freedom, about wide open spaces, individual rights, and the right of every person to be left alone. But the comfortable version of that story is told from courthouses and state capitals. The real version was written in swamp water and mountain moonlight and canyon dust. Written by people who didn't wait for freedom to be granted by a government. They went out into the wilderness and took it. Were they criminals? Some of them, by any reasonable definition, yes. Were they dangerous? Often were they living in ways that caused harm to others. Sometimes deeply so. But they were also, in a strange and uncomfortable way, living out the purest version of the American promise. No masters, no debts, no one to answer to but the land, the seasons, and the people they'd chosen to call family. And here is the question I'll leave you with tonight. Not as a celebration of lawlessness, but as a genuine, unsettling inquiry. For, in a world that has mapped every mountain, taxed every income, and documented every birth and death, is the kind of freedom those people had even possible anymore? And if it isn't, what exactly did we lose when we paved the last dirt road and put up the last cell tower? Think about that. And if this history moved you, if it made you see this country a little differently, hit like. Leave a comment and tell me, which forgotten frontier should we explore next?